My name's Alison Evans and I'm the Director of ODI, and I'd like to warmly welcome you to this anniversary debate on international development the next 20 years. And we thought what is effectively coming towards the end of our 50th anniversary celebrations in ODI, that this was a really interesting moment to reflect a little bit on the last few decades, but more importantly, to throw our thinking forward into the immediate future, to start scanning, well, what might be the issues that are at the top of our agendas, our collective agendas, in 20 years' time. Well, today we want to try and cast our minds forward and say, okay, there's evidence of real progress, of real change. What about the next 2 decades? What is that going to be about? What would be the biggest development challenge or the biggest development problem you think we're going to be focusing on in 2031? And what do we need to be thinking about now in terms of some of the solutions that might need to be in place to address that?
Thank you, Alison, very much. And I would introduce each of the panel before they speak, and each is going to offer us 7 minutes of their wisdom and provocation. And then hopefully we can open it up, because there are some remarkable characters here in the audience. Indeed, the whole audience is full of remarkable characters who can participate in this, and we want to encourage the widest debate possible. Where better to start than with Mark Moody-Stewart, who I think, as everybody knows, he's both, well, poacher and gamekeeper.
Thank you very much, John. And could I start by wishing ODI a happy birthday or a happy anniversary year? I believe that a big thrust in development is going to come with the involvement of business and the need to create business and enterprise. Unless we create enterprise in countries and allow it to flourish as an essential part of overseas development, I don't think we'll make that much progress. Business does play a key role, but it needs to do so in common with other sectors of society. And one of the most important initiatives of the United Nations Global Compact is, in fact, the local networks of the Compact. The work that businesses are doing increasingly with civil society is hugely important. For 30 years or so, businesses have worked on agricultural extension through livestock development and improved strains and so on. It's what I call the sort of cows, pigs and donkeys phase, which has now got into the Christmas gifts area. And it's very commendable, but actually it only lifts people from low-grade subsistence into slightly higher-grade subsistence. So I think one of the challenges we'll have with 9 billion people is how to find livelihoods at a higher level, given the inexorable urbanization which is going on, migration from country, and how you make agriculture more efficient. I think we need to look and learn from China. I mean, China is probably undoubtedly the country which has lifted most people out of poverty. And I think we need to study how they've done it. I think we should look at business efforts which have been made with governments and others on things like the investment climate facility in Africa, which is an effort to work with governments to remove the barriers to enterprise development. And if you remove those, you benefit not just big business, but businesses of every sort. And I think that's extremely important, and we need to do more work. But in order to do that work, I think you do need an alliance between different sectors of society, because no single business can fix it. Business alone coalitions, inevitably, given human nature, will tend to go in the direction of favoring business. If you put them together with civil society, I think you keep everybody honest, and business can also help to keep not-for-profit institutions honest as well. So I'm a great enthusiast of that approach.
Might as well look and learn with Linda, you next. She is an economist, but one of these remarkable economists that can speak plain English to an ordinary audience. Her research focuses on the drivers of economic growth and the rise of emerging economies. So she is pretty well placed to talk to us in Mark's wake.
Thank you, John. First of all, let me add my good wishes to the ODI on its 50th anniversary. Tremendous achievement. And I'd like to just spend my 7 minutes just talking through a few issues that I see on the horizon. But first, I'm going to look back and just talk a bit about China. As Sir Mark has said, it is one of the most extraordinary stories in terms of having lifted millions of people out of poverty. And I want to think about the opportunities and challenges of a world where the biggest economies may not be the rich countries anymore, the Chinas, the Indias. What kind of world would that be? China's lifted 400 million people out of poverty, abject poverty. Of course, there's still challenges which remain. A good third of the Chinese population still live on less than $2 per day, and there's probably about 100 million people who live on less than $1.25 a day. You often now hear about the Beijing consensus instead of the Washington consensus. What I want to suggest is that it's very dangerous to substitute one model for another model because the context of China is very difficult to replicate. When you peel behind the surface, it's not so evident that the Beijing consensus somehow is really a state-led model. In fact, a lot of it is about injecting market incentives. But crucially, a difference is there was a lot more attention paid to institutions in China. So the pacing of the reforms is slower in China than you have had under other development models. Informal institutions. You don't need to have a perfectly formed legal system with well-defined property rights and everything sorted out first. You build on the natural relationships within a country and develop those. And organically, that development seems to take hold better than, for instance, if a legal system were thrusted on a country. It's very unusual for the world's second biggest economy to be a poor country. So it raises several questions. China as competitor, and this has certainly been the case for some Central American countries, which export goods very similar to China. Two, China as funder, both in terms of aid, which is controversial in that a lot of the aid given by China is not done on a multilateral basis. There isn't a great deal of coordination in terms of the governance focus you often see now in terms of giving. But China as investor, building infrastructure, and again, helpful in that the African subcontinent requires a great deal more investment in infrastructure, but the way the Chinese have done it raises questions as well. And then finally, China's growth engine. For a developing country to be a growth driver, China is still in the middle of transitioning and its markets are relatively closed. And that does raise impediments to using China as a real growth driver. I think one of the most extraordinary turning points in this global crisis was clearly the G20 coming to the fore. And again, I want to sort of emphasize, there's only one African country that sits on the G20. And it is a global body that has become more important. But in terms of setting rules and norms around the world, it's not clear to me exactly how the system of governance really will evolve. And just very finally, I think, in terms of economic governance, there is no question it's more important than before, but there's also no question to me that getting more participation from developing countries so that anything which gets agreed, WTO on the environment, rules governing financial markets, all of these things are properly representative. And that is a change I hope is coming.
Rakesh Rajani, the founder of Twaweza Nisisi, is about opening up opaqueness, about penetrating the elements of life that many regimes around the world would like to keep quiet. His speciality is Tanzania and East Africa. What a challenge.
The story of development in the next 20 years is not going to feature development with a capital D at the center of it. And in the face of it, I think development looks so increasingly irrelevant. I do think we are on the cusp of a new norm, a new global norm, a new public norm, a new national and local norm in terms of transparency. Partly fueled by what is possible technologically, One can gather information and put it in one place and crunch it and analyze it and share it. Most importantly, visualize it at a speed and at a level and a multiplicity that simply was not possible before the sort of computing power we have. Inevitably, the transparency stuff is going to push, whether they will be willing, as in the case in part with the Obama administration, or whether they will be fighting but being pushed along towards more open government. I think it'll be increasingly difficult. They will try, of course, but I think it'll be increasingly difficult for many governments to continue not operating in a very open way. The second big idea we'll see in development is that the citizen will become the key unit of reference. Much more so than communities, and I would argue, I think, also more so than governments. Not that governments are not important, of course, they're crucially important. But I think we see already a trend towards the individual becoming a crucial unit. So we don't have time to hang out together and we all becoming atomized, and certainly there is a certain loss of communal identity. But for many of us, where the communal identity has been so oppressive, it's actually liberating. The individual will be able to will think much more in relation to herself, will make choices, I think, much more in relation to herself, will create identities and create alliances that I think will have will be more elastic, more flexible, and see different norms than we've seen in so far. What does that mean now for governments? What does that mean for the global institutions, such as the UN and many others? We have a real crisis at an ideological level in the realm of ideas. We have much less faith in our leaders, in our institutions, even in terms of the future as we know it. I think another development is there's much less faith in that salvation will come from outside. Whether that outside is the donor and aid, certainly, or whether it is the investor for that matter, there is a sense, certainly in East Africa, that we need to look in the mirror. And I think that is the start of what I call imagination. I would like to think that the spread of communication technologies is going to fuel imagination. I think a kind of democratization of access to ideas and the ability to create, generate, and share ideas is going to fuel it. I don't know. But I think in the next 20 years we're going to be talking a great deal more about imagination. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Rakesh. What a fascinating offering, which has implications from everywhere, from Jeddah to London. Thank you very much. And our final but not least speaker is Andre Carter. She's a scientist, director of the UK Collaboration on Development Scientists.
First of all, I want to just define what I consider to be development science. It's not just the natural and the physical sciences. It's absolutely essential we look at the social and the human sciences and interaction with technology and innovation. So when I talk science, it includes all of those. And if there's a purist amongst you, I'd even include engineering in that as well. So to look forwards, I think we have to look at where we are now. And at the end of the 20th century, we set up Millennium Development Goals. We put in Goal 2, which was to achieve universal primary education. And what did that do? It's taken the attention away from university investments in developing countries. Science has stagnated to a large degree. There's always exceptions. There's been a divergence. Developed countries, or I heard somebody say the other day, overdeveloped countries, which I thought was quite a good expression. They've gone the route of innovation. They've worked, as Mark said, with business. Whereas developing countries, we've given aid. Most of the world's problems are very complex, and yet funding comes out through ministries, research councils, certainly in the UK, which focus on individual subjects. We're beginning to see more multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, but to solve the world's problems, we've got to be far more holistic in our approaches. Another important thing, I think, is the global funds which are coming onto the marketplace, if you like, the West, the North's apologies for climate change. $100 billion by 2020 for a green fund for adaptation. The UK at the moment is looking at putting out in this CSR period $3.2 billion for adaptation, and put that against the cuts that are going on elsewhere. There is certainly a different funding dynamic coming out. New platforms, new technology that's come out. Again, it's something which both the rich and the poor can turn to and accelerates the science, looking at whether it be crop development, vaccines, nanotechnology. They're all new platforms that have different types of investment models. Capacity building, everybody talks about it, but up to now it's largely been on individuals. We've got to assist scientists interact globally. We've got to look at working with countries to help them award their own grants. I think appropriate technologies is what we're actually looking for. It doesn't matter whether they come from international, from the West. It doesn't matter whether they're based on indigenous knowledge or a mix. It's about being appropriate.
Thank you very much indeed, Andre. And we have a sort of really interesting latticework of thoughts here. Does anybody disagree with Rakesh's principal point that the capital D is effectively dead?
I wanted to challenge, actually. I think that the most exciting thing that has, as Linda told us, that has happened is actually development, because these countries like China, Vietnam, many others have actually emerged and have become major actors, have elevated people from poverty. And I think the challenge for the future is how to combine very rapid growth, as countries like China have achieved, with equality, as is in Alison's question, and also with all those very severe environmental constraints.
Growth has been really important for countries like China, like India, like Indonesia, like Vietnam, like lots of countries. But the problem from China is growth without a focus on development raises problems for the society in terms of high levels of income inequality, in terms of the pressure on natural resources. Can you really just focus on growth? And even China's beginning to not do that.
So certainly from the science point of view, I fully agree with you. We don't have a sustainable model either here or in developing countries, and we haven't found that yet. WWF did some work a few years ago looking at how many planets we need. And I don't know whether you saw that, but the UK needs 3 planets to live on. The Americans need 5. There's a lot of interest now in green growth, looking at low carbon technologies. The green paper on consultation paper on for science is about bringing together science and innovation, but very much about for the benefit of EU countries. And so there does seem a tension there which we need to address.
I'd like to ask something about capital flows. We hosted Dev Carr of Global Financial Integrity at Parliament recently, and he has this figure that something between $850 billion and $1.8 trillion have left Africa illicitly between 1980 and 2000. So I just wonder what Africa might look like now if it had had what is in effect between 2 and 3 times the amount given in aid already there and for its own use. And I just wonder how long you feel that Britain can go on pretending they're on the side of good things in Africa if it's actually taking money out like that. Mainly through, he said, multinational companies mispricing and transfer pricing, but also through corruption money, much of which flows through the British-owned offshore islands and into the City of London, which is why nobody here is really very interested in doing anything about it.
I mean, if you look at any country, the question is, are the bandits and robber barons investing in their own country, or do they see more opportunity outside it? And what you see in China, for example, where there are robber barons, where they're actually investing in China to a large extent. And that's why I think you have to look at the capacity of the economy in removing the barriers and giving opportunities for business growth and investment opportunities in the country. But time and again you see that what actually attracts people is properly functioning, transparent countries. What bothers business is the dream that by starting, for example, in the United States and applying US regulation to the whole world, you only hit a small